We are excited to be making our very first set of predictions for Oxford AQA GCSE Psychology. This year, we've listened and we're expanding our support to help even more of you with your revision and exam preparation. So, Laura, our head of psychology, has done an in depth review of the topics and has used this information to create psychology predicted papers specifically for this year. You can get both predicted papers for paper 1 and paper 2. We've developed for this year along with all the video walkthroughs. To access these predicted papers, simply follow the link in the description below. Alongside these papers, Laura has also created video walkthroughs for both papers so you can see exactly what a top band answer looks like in psychology. These videos will guide you through the skills needed to interpret questions, understand what's being asked, and structure your responses effectively. You'll encounter questions designed in the same style as those you'll see in your exams, enabling you to break down the questions, identify what needs to be included in your answers, and how to structure them. It will help you feel confident and fully prepared when you sit the real exam. Remember to revise all topics, as these are just predictions. We don't have any additional kind of insider information or insights into the actual exams. We haven't seen the real papers. Let's start with paper 1, cognition and behaviour. Now, we know for paper 1, cognition and behaviour, there are 4 sections in the paper. That's memory, perception, biopsychology and research methods, and we'll go through each of these topics in this video. You can use the timestamps in the description to jump to the section that you're interested in, or you can just sit back and listen. So first up, memory. Look at the working memory model. Make sure you understand the different components of Baddeley and Hitch's model, including the central executive, phonological loop, visuospatial sketchpad, and episodic buffer. Be prepared to explain each component's role in working memory, how they interact, and evaluate the model with strengths such as its detailed explanation of short-term memory processes and limitations like its complexity and limited understanding of the central executive. Here also look into Bartlett's theory of reconstructive memory and War of the Ghost study. Ensure you can describe the main concepts of reconstructive memory, such as how memory is influenced by schemas. For the War of the Ghost study, focus on the aim, procedure, findings and conclusion. Be ready to evaluate the study, considering strengths like its insight into how memory is not a direct recall of events, and limitations including low ecological validity and the potential influence of cultural bias. Brush up on Murdoch's serial position curve study too. Understand Murdoch's findings on the primacy and recency effect, describing how it supports the distinction between short-term and long-term memory. Be prepared to outline the aim, procedure, findings and conclusions, as well as to evaluate the study, discussing strengths such as its controlled design and weaknesses like its limited real-world applicability. And finally, on memory, look at factors affecting accuracy of memory, that being interference, context and false memories. Learn about how interference, both proactive and retroactive, and context such as environmental cues can influence memory recall. Additionally, understand how false memories are created and affect memory accuracy. Be ready to evaluate these factors, considering strengths such as their support from experimental studies and limitations such as individual differences in susceptibility to these effects. For the next part of your paper 1, perception, revisit monocular depth cues. Here, be familiar with the main monocular depth cues, including relative size, height in the plane, linear perspective, and occlusion. You should be able to define each cue and explain how they assist in perceiving depth. Practice applying these cues to various scenarios or images to demonstrate understanding. Revisit Gregory's constructivist theory of perception too. Review Gregory's theory, especially his view that perception is a constructive process involving top-down processing, where our brain interprets sensory information using prior knowledge and context. Be ready to evaluate this theory, discussing strengths such as explaining visual illusions and limitations, like underestimating bottom-up processing, which involves direct sensory input. And finally, consider the effect of motivation on perceptual set. Understand how motivation, such as hunger or desire, can influence what we perceive. So, for example, perceiving ambiguous images as food-related when hungry. Be prepared with examples or studies demonstrating this effect and be ready to evaluate it, highlighting strengths like its relevance in understanding individual perception differences and limitations, such as the challenge in isolating motivation from other influences. You then have biopsychology. Here, look at the endocrine system, specifically the role of glands. Know the major glands in the endocrine system, so for example, pituitary, adrenal, and their roles in releasing hormones that regulate bodily functions. Be ready to describe examples such as how the adrenal glands release adrenaline in response to stress. Don't forget to revise the release and uptake of neurotransmitters too. Familiarise yourself with the basic processes of neurotransmitters and the release from presynaptic neurons, their travel across the synaptic gap, and uptake by receptors on the postsynaptic neuron. Understand key neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, and be prepared to discuss how imbalances in these neurotransmitters relate to mental health issues. Finally, here, revise Penfield's study of the interpretive cortex. Review Penfield's study, which used electrical stimulation to map the brain's interpretive cortex and explore its role in perception and memory recall. Be ready to describe the aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions of the study and to evaluate its strengths, such as its pioneering contribution to neuroscience and its limitations, like ethical concerns and generalizability, due to the sample being mostly epilepsy patients. And of course, do not forget research methods. Embrace research methods across both of the papers. Recognise that research methods content appears in both of them, not just paper one. You'll find dedicated research methods sections in both paper one and paper two, so always be ready. Familiarise yourself with examples of research and identify key elements such as hypotheses, variables, control measures, samples used, ethics, and data collected. Exposure to different research scenarios will better prepare you for the new piece of research you'll face in this section. Okay, that is paper one. We are now moving on to paper two, social context and behaviour. We know for paper two, social context and behaviour, there are 4 sections in the paper. That's communication, social influence, mental health, and research methods. And we will go through each of these topics in this video. You can then use the timestamps, like I said before, to jump to the section you're interested in, or you can just sit back and listen again. So first up, let's look at communication. Revise the properties of human communication not present in animal communication. Make sure you understand the unique properties of human communication, such as displacement and productivity, which are generally absent in animal communication. Be ready to explain these properties and why they suggest that human communication is more complex and flexible. Consider how this distinguishes human communication from other species. Look into body language, specifically open-closed posture, postural echo, and touch. Know the different types of body language and what they signify, including open and closed postures, postural echo, and the use of touch. Be able to describe examples of each and discuss how these non-verbal cues can affect social interactions. Do also look into neonate research too, specifically focusing on evidence that non-verbal behaviour is innate. Understand how studies with neonates, that's newborns, provide evidence that certain non-verbal behaviours such as facial expressions are innate rather than learned. Be able to describe research methods used with neonates and explain how findings support the idea that aspects of non-verbal behaviour are biologically pre-programmed. Finally here, look at Yuki's study of emoticons. Be familiar with Yuki's study, which examined cultural differences in interpreting emotions through emoticons. Make sure you can describe the aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions of this study. Be prepared to evaluate it by considering factors such as cross-cultural validity and potential limitations in using emoticons as representations of real emotions. Our next topic is social influence. So here, look at the impact of similarity on bystander behaviour. Understand how similarity to a person in need can affect bystander behaviour, increasing the likelihood of intervention. Be able to explain research findings on this topic and discuss real-life implications for understanding why people help or fail to help others. Do also brush up on Latané and Dali's smoke study. Know the details of this study, which investigated the diffusion of responsibility when people witness an emergency. Be prepared to describe the aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions, and evaluate the study by discussing factors such as ecological validity and ethical considerations. Then you've got Levine's football supporter study. Familiarise yourself with Levine's study on in-group bias and helping behaviour among football supporters, being able to explain how in-group identification can affect bystander intervention, and discuss the strengths and limitations of this study, including its ecological validity. You've also got Pilyarvin's subway study. Review the details of Pilyarvin's field experiment, which explored factors influencing helping behaviour on a subway. Know the study's aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions, and be prepared to evaluate it by discussing strengths such as high ecological validity and limitations like ethical concerns. Finally, we have de-individuation and collective behaviour. Understand the concept of de-individuation and how it can lead to changes in individual behaviour within groups, particularly in situations involving anonymity. Be ready to explain examples of de-individuation and collective behaviour, and evaluate the concept by discussing both its supporting evidence and limitations. Your next topic is mental health. Look into OCD, making sure you know the difference between obsessions and compulsions. Be able to distinguish between obsessions, persistent unwanted thoughts, and compulsions, repetitive behaviours aimed at reducing distress. Understand how each affects individuals with OCD and be ready to apply this knowledge to scenarios. Then revise biological explanation of OCD. Familiarise yourself with the biological factors thought to contribute to OCD, including genetic and neurological explanations. Be able to describe specific biological mechanisms, such as the role of the basal ganglia, and evaluate these explanations by considering strengths like supporting research evidence and limitations, including reductionism. You should also brush up on Kern's study of CBT's effectiveness for OCD. Know the aim, procedure, findings, and conclusions of Kern's study, which investigated the effectiveness of cognitive behavioural therapy for treating OCD. Be prepared to evaluate the study by discussing strengths such as its real-world applications and limitations like the potential for bias in self-reported measures. Finally, for mental health, we have the dual representation theory of PTSD. Understand the dual representation theory, which suggests that PTSD symptoms arise from the interplay between sensory and contextual memory representations. Be able to explain how this theory accounts for the intrusive memories and flashbacks typical in PTSD, and evaluate it by considering both supporting evidence and limitations in explaining the complexity of PTSD symptoms. And of course, it's worth just mentioning research methods again, just in case you missed it on the timestamps. Like I said before, research methods is important for both papers, not just paper 2. So make sure you're comfortable with examples of research and be able to pick out key features such as hypotheses, variables, control measures, samples used, ethics, and data collected. The more you expose yourself to different research scenarios, the better prepared you will be for any new piece of research you'll face in this section. So those are our Oxford AQA predictions for 2025. We really hope they're useful. Don't forget to use these as a guide for your revision, but don't ignore other areas you need to brush up on too, as of course these are just predictions. We wish you the very best of luck for your 2025 psychology exam.